Welcome to the latest in a series of discussions about Europe's blue economy, the use of its seas, and both the economic opportunities and the challenges to the environment that they present. I'm Chris Davies, a long-standing member of the European Parliament's Environment Committee and now a senior advisor with Pedersen Public Affairs in Brussels. The European Commission last month adopted its communication on the blue economy, how it seeks to shape development of the seas, of the marine environment in a sustainable way. And this document provides a framework for specific proposals that we'll see brought forward over the next few months and years. Today, we're going to explore how we make best use of the seas to build this stronger economy, while at the same time protecting and restoring life in the marine environment. So with me to discuss these issues, I have Nicola, Notaro, Head of the Nature Protection Unit in the European Commission, Giles Dickson, Chief Executive of WindEurope, and Julliand of TotalEnergies and Chair of the Marine and Environment Committee with the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. And it's IOGP, it's thanks to IOGP that this debate is taking place, thanks to their support and sponsorship. And so let me invite François-Régis Mouton, their Head of Director of European Affairs, to say a few words by way of introduction. François-Régis, over to you.
Many thanks, Giles, for your kind introduction. Always a pleasure to be in these webinars with you, moderated beautifully by you. And indeed, today we're here to talk about the actions that we can take to protect and conserve biodiversity while carrying out economic conditions. And I want to thank the participants, Nicola, Marine, and Giles, in advance for their contributions. These are issues that all users of the marine environment face to some degree or another, and it's our common responsibility indeed to address the concerns of policymakers and the ones of the public. Looking at the heated debate in my home country, France, on offshore windmill installation, I couldn't help but think that it has almost become more difficult to be in the wind industry sometimes than in the oil and gas. And I must say, I feel less lonely now with you, my dear Giles, on the same boat sometimes. I know this is a sensitive issue, but like many others, it's important that scientific data be taken into consideration when delivering legislation related to offshore operations. At IOGP, we have been working for over 20 years to enhance biodiversity management in the oil and gas industry, and we promote good practices for the conservation and mitigation of biodiversity impacts. We are involved in 6 global ocean research programs, ranging from geomix to oceanography. 2 of our joint industry projects on underwater sound and marine life, €60 million budget spent over the last 10 years, much more than many other research programs, were endorsed as official contributions to the UN Ocean Decade on the 8th of June, World Oceans Day. I want to insist on this. Oil and gas operations are compatible with the protection status of certain areas when good biodiversity and ecosystem services management practices are implemented. Can we do better? Certainly. That's why it's important to keep these discussions going between all parties involved. Thanks again for tuning in today. I really look forward to a lively discussion on such an interesting topic. I know it's dear to your heart as well, Chris, and I give you the floor back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, François-Régis. And Nicola, Head of Nature Protection with the European Commission. That's a David Attenborough role with the ability to actually put forward specific legislative proposals, I imagine. Just looking at the Commission's communication on the blue economy, it describes an economy that needs to be stronger and fairer. It says it must be put on a more sustainable path. And in inverted commas, I read out, biodiversity protection should be a fundamental principle of maritime economic activity. We'll just spell out for us, what are the problems there at the moment? What needs to be addressed?
Oh, well, first of all, thanks for the flattering comparison, but I'm very far from Sir Attenborough charisma and impact, I'm afraid. But still, we're doing our little bit in order to contribute to saving our biodiversity. Of course, the context of this is the one of the Green Deal that the Commission has put forward, which tries to build a new green growth agenda for the European Union, while at the same time addressing the two global crises which are so interlinked: climate change and biodiversity loss. And the loss is massive. We're talking about the sixth mass extinction, as some scientists put it. And these challenges are very big, both in land use and in sea uses, because they are both identified as one of the 5 major causes of biodiversity loss. In the marine environment, of course, one very big obstacle is also the lack of knowledge, in the sense that it's, of course, is a more difficult environment and our knowledge is more limited, and therefore our action to prevent biodiversity loss is also made more complicated. But we do know that there are a lot of pressures, and these pressures need to be addressed. They derive from land. They derive from pollution. 80% of the marine pollution is land-based in its origin, but also they derive from activities that take place at sea. And of course, overfishing has been the focus of attention for a number of years in order to improve the situation. But there are other uses, from shipping to, in certain coastal areas, unsustainable tourism, to, of course, the challenges that I'm sure my fellow speakers today are very concerned about, which are energy developments. And of course, the Blue Economy communication tries to put all of this together to get a bit of an overview of all the challenges, so that we take a strategic approach. And to take that strategic approach, you need to take action from all angles: from the biodiversity protection angle, from the zero pollution angle, from the circular economy angle, and then you need to, of course, put into that picture the social aspect and the economic development aspect. So that's the big challenge we have.
Yeah, a big challenge indeed, and a complex one. Let me turn to Giles Dickson. Giles, Chief Executive of WindEurope. I mean, in the Blue Economy package, the expectation is there will be an enormous increase in offshore wind power generation over the next few years. It's going to be the biggest physical change we see, because these structures rise above the waves. I mean, do you expect, I mean, what is it, a 5-fold, a 6-fold increase envisaged over the next 9 years? Is that really feasible?
Okay, well, let me share with you the numbers, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this discussion. The European Union today has 15 gigawatts of offshore wind farms. By 2030, to answer your question now, Chris, we expect the European Union to have at least 60 gigawatts of offshore wind. And by 2050, the EU has agreed that we should have 300 gigawatts of offshore wind. So that is a 20-fold increase in the amount of offshore wind between now and 2050. Now, first of all, how much sea space is this going to take up? The 300 gigawatts would take up in total 7% of the sea space around the European Union. Now, that doesn't mean to say that 7% is used exclusively for offshore wind. Far from it. We are firm believers in the multiple use of the sea space where we are developing and operating wind farms. The distance between turbines in individual wind farms is getting larger all the time, and that's because the turbines themselves are getting larger. It's going to be quite normal in the future for one turbine to be spaced 1 kilometer away from the closest other turbine in the same wind farm. That means that it will be quite normal to do certain types of fishing, passive and pelagic fishing, inside wind farms. Denmark already allows for that, so does the UK. Belgium is allowing for it in its new wind farm zone that it's developing. We do not envisage bottom trawling taking place inside offshore wind farms, and there are a lot of other reasons for not allowing bottom trawling in certain parts of the marine environment, of course. What is happening actually to biodiversity in and around these offshore wind farms?
You anticipate my question. Go on.
Okay, do you want me to go there now or
no,
save it?
I
want to know, are wind farms good for fish or bad for fish?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the first point is, once you've built a wind farm, you significantly reduce the seabed disturbing activity in that marine area. There's no bottom trawling, as I've said. There is no dredging. So we have a cleaner seabed. We can actually develop artificial reefs on the seabed inside offshore wind farms, which can be used for aquaculture. We are now actively farming mussels and oysters in offshore wind farms in Belgium and the Netherlands. In fact, the Dutch are farming oysters for the first time now for 100 years, thanks to offshore wind. Secondly, the fact that we have foundations of the turbines connected to the seabed gives us artificial substrates which provide ideal conditions for certain benthic and fish species.
Benthic is the fish that feed on the ocean floor.
Exactly, yeah. Now, the European Parliament produced a report on this last year and found that as a result of this, offshore wind farms can provide high-quality spawning, nursery, and feeding grounds for fish. Let me give you one fact. Each individual offshore wind turbine and its foundation, and there's up to 50 meters worth of foundation between the surface of the sea and the seabed, each foundation can support up to 4 tons of shellfish. Now, clearly that attracts other marine wildlife into the offshore wind farm. And all the studies we've done so far, and that others, academics and so on, have done, show that that gives us a healthy marine ecosystem, often healthier than the marine ecosystem that existed in that marine area before the construction of the offshore wind farm. All the indications are that larger sea mammals, including seals, harbor porpoises, are thriving inside offshore wind farms. So that is positive. Now, there is one very important factor, which is the installation of the foundation into the seabed. We pile it into the seabed. It has to be fixed firmly into the seabed.
So that means huge disturbance and a lot of underwater noise, which of course, dolphins, for example, will be very reluctant to tolerate, to put it mildly.
We are extremely conscious of the potentially negative biodiversity impacts of this process during the installation construction phase. So what we do is we have a system of bubble curtains. These are very large circular hoses with holes in them that are laid on the seabed in circles around the foundation when it's being piled into the seabed. When the piling starts, we turn on the bubble curtains and they release literally circular curtains of bubbles that rise up to the surface of the sea. Now, the porpoises and other mammals, they are protected. It creates a protective curtain against the sound and what would otherwise be, as you say, Chris, significant disturbance to them. And this is used now as a standard noise mitigation technology when we're doing the installation.
Okay, thanks, Giles. Thanks. Fascinating introduction. Let me just turn to marine now. I mean, the oil and gas industry, though. I mean, you've been here before in terms of building structures in the sea. I mean, first of all, the first question is, those structures are going to be there for a long time to come, aren't they? I mean, the North Sea, for example, has an enormous. If you look at the map, and I've seen it, there's an enormous infrastructure of pipelines and steel works out in the North Sea. I mean, what's going to happen to those? And indeed, from the biodiversity point of view, what should happen to them?
So, hello, everybody. And first, thank you very much for welcoming me. And I'm very pleased to be part of this panel session today. So, and we did already touched on so many biodiversity topics: underwater noise, its structures. As you said, in the North Sea today, we already have large amounts of installations, and what happened to them at the end of their life really depends on the structure and the location. And what we're finding is that in going back to what we need, which is knowledge and science, what we need is to make a decision based on the science and what would be the best for the environment. And the vast majority of the infrastructures, like the steel jackets, the lighter steel jackets, would be removed and taken on shore.
I don't understand what a steel jacket is.
Oh, it's a jacket made out of steel.
Yes, still don't understand what it is.
So, and the regulatory framework in let's take the OSPAR region, for instance. Currently, there is a OSPAR 98/3 resolution that says that when you take these infrastructures and take them back on shore during decommissioning, with some exceptions. And so what we will see is that the large majority will be taken on shore, but in some cases they will not. And what we're noticing, and what R&D, research and development projects, are helping us understand, is that in some cases it is not the best option for the environment to remove everything. And it makes sense from an environmental viewpoint to leave in place.
So if I'm right, Marie, the OSPAR Convention, which signed by the European Union and by many other countries of Europe, says that these structures should be removed. And you're arguing that in some cases there's a good argument for saying that for biodiversity and environmental reasons they should be left in place.
Indeed. What we're saying is that in some cases, it makes environmental sense to leave them in place. Of course, this has to be safe for other sea users, and of course, it has to be safe in terms of pollution, right? We can't allow accidental discharges or other type of pollutions to happen. But what we're noticing, and we've got R&D projects looking at it, and research done by universities, and I could quote the Insight project in the UK, very interesting, looking at several years of the infrastructures and the communities that have developed on the structures and their value for the environment. So what we're noticing is that these hard structures are now valuable habitat. We've got large amount of communities that have colonized the structures. And you mentioned pipelines. So pipelines is not part of the OSPAR framework, but we are starting to see research and scientific studies looking at environmental impact of leaving pipelines in place or removing pipelines. And
yeah, I mean, if you think about it, and if a pipeline's not going to be reused, for example, for carbon capture, if it's been there for 40 or 50 years, it's going to be covered in marine life, and to tear it up is simply going to damage, isn't it? I mean, I imagine damage that marine environment.
So we wouldn't say there's a black and white answer. What we're advocating is to use state of the science methods to assess what the best environmental option, commissioning option is.
Okay.
And really, it is on a case-by-case basis.
Right. Let me turn. I'll come back to you, of course. Nicola, there we are. Your objective is to protect and restore the biodiversity of the seas. Now, A major part of that is the extension of marine protected areas. I think we have in Europe about 11–12% of the seas are theoretically declared as marine protected areas, although very few of those are proper protection. I've heard the Commissioner in the past describe them as only being paper protected, without proper enforcement of rules. So what are you proposing? What's the Commission planning on doing over the next year or so to strengthen this designation?
Yes, if you allow me, I will also maybe start with a comment on what my colleagues just said and address your question just immediately after that. Impacts indeed can be mitigated, but there is, as I said, a lot of scientific uncertainty as well. And impacts of noise have been mentioned, impacts of vibration, impacts of electromagnetic fields generated by wind turbines are not so well studied. So there is a lot more analysis that is needed in relation to them. And indeed, the case-by-case approach in relation to removing structures that have been there. And in the Northern Sea, I think there are more than 14,000 kilometers of those structures. So it's absolutely enormous. Imagine the impact of removing all of that. But what can we do to save biodiversity at sea? And indeed, marine protected areas are a key tool. In fact, a lot of the sea bottom has been damaged very heavily by bottom trawling and many other activities. And one of the things that we should exploit is the capacity of the sea to actually self-restore itself. And this can happen, of course, when you exclude the damaging activities that have a major impact. So one of the key tools for us at sea is certainly strictly protected areas. We would like to extend marine protected areas. The goal is to cover 30% of the sea. But also there is a distinction in the biodiversity strategy because marine protected areas generally, and then 10% of the sea that should indeed fall within strictly protected areas, where of course the number of activities that would continue would be much more limited. Now, this presupposes that you do a really good maritime spatial planning in which you take into account all the factors that we've been discussing. You know, how much space we need for wind energy, for tidal energy, for fishing and the protected areas themselves. And then you have a global vision of the uses of the sea. So the Commission is going to propose actually by the end of this year, if we manage and my colleagues don't crack under pressure before, legally binding standards for restoration, which will cover both biodiversity on land and at sea, and will build on the existing legislation, the Habitats and Birds, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the Water Framework Directive that also covers seawaters within 1 mile from the coastline. So this will be a major tool which will be complemented by the extension of the Marine Protected Areas Network. And then the third element of the package is an action plan we are developing with our colleagues in charge of fisheries, which will tackle specifically the issues of, at least from our perspective, environmental perspective, the issues of bottom trawling, bycatch, incidental catch, and measures in marine protected areas. So these are the key tools on which we are working very hard in order to, yes, have an impact in the near future.
Well, okay, thank you for that. But you know, I'm a former chair of the European Parliament's Fisheries Committee, so you know, I've many times heard the argument for fishermen that these marine protected areas are almost designed to prevent them carrying out their own work and their own business to curb fishing activities. And I've also, of course, heard them directing their ire at wind farms and saying, you know, these wind farms are designed as exclusion zones, which will prevent us carrying out our traditional fishing activities. Giles has talked about mussels and such like, but you know, many fishermen don't regard that as proper fishing. So just tell me, can MPAs, marine protected areas, how well do they coincide with wind farms? And what sort of political resistance do you expect when these proposals are announced? Nicola.
Yes.
Yeah, you're still on the spot, I'm afraid.
Yes. happy to be on the spot. It's a good question. The marine protected areas don't exclude per se any activity unless we're talking of the strictly protected areas, where I said the number of activities will be reduced for sure, because otherwise the strict protection would make no sense. Within marine protected areas, we already have, in fact, wind farms, and I'm sure we will have in the future, and we already have fishing activities. But of course, the question is how you regulate those activities, how you locate, for instance, the wind farms in the areas where they don't collide with migration routes of birds. We have developed, together with stakeholders, for instance, sensitivity maps and methodologies for the further deployment of them, which will be very helpful in identifying the areas in which you can best locate wind farm and reducing environmental impacts. That is a key tool, but I think Giles said 7% of the ocean is needed. That may look huge, but actually the ocean is much bigger than that. So there is also the 93% left outside wind farmed areas. And but the idea is not really to create exclusion areas where one part of the ocean is only for one thing and another part of the ocean is for the other thing. There will be essentially a combination of activities, and then the intensity of these activities, of course, in marine protected areas will be reduced compared to areas outside. And then within strictly protected areas will be even much more reduced, because obviously there you are hoping to get some a phenomenon of restoration of the biodiversity by self-healing, if you like, of the oceans, which will be extremely beneficial for fishermen, because it's a fact, it's proven scientifically that actually exclusion of fishing from certain core areas increases the rate of reproduction of the fish, and therefore the yields around that. We have examples from Italy, examples from Spain.
We have these examples, Nicola, and you know I've quoted them many times myself. I just find that fishermen are enormously cynical when we do it, and say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? You know,
Yes, but I mean, this is all about communication and dialogue and going on the ground, in this case on the sea, and talking to the people and developing a partnership with them. It will not happen, you know, through a digital conference in Brussels, but it will happen if we go on the ground with the local authorities and we discuss what's in the best interest of everyone.
Thank you. Giles, you talked earlier about the massive expansion forecast for wind energy. I just wonder, and you try to portray the best possible relationship between wind turbines and fishing activities, but I imagine that your relationship with the fishing industry can't be that warm, because there is this degree of, if not outright hostility, concern that traditional fishing grounds are going to be cut off from fishermen. And at all stages of this process, in all matters of dealing with climate change, Europe seems to be locked in in administrative inertia. It's very difficult to get things carried out quickly. There's so many procedures that have to be followed before you can actually get a final investment decision and work started. I mean, the ambitions you have are so huge. Can they really be met and proper consultation be carried out at the same time?
Yes, they can be, provided we do all the necessary stakeholder consultation, as you say, Chris. Let me give you a few examples of how we engage with the fishing industry. So every time we build a new offshore wind farm, we talk to the local fishing industry, assuming there is one. Usually there is. And the first question that comes up is, okay, there's a risk of reduced catch. Where that risk is well established, then compensation is paid to the fishing communities. The second thing we do is we share with the fishing communities the designs of the offshore wind farm. And if the jurisdiction allows for passive or pelagic fishing inside the offshore wind farm, we will say to the fishing community, okay, look at the layout. How would you feel about fishing inside that wind farm? And in some instances, they will say, can you put the turbines slightly further apart? Can you have wider corridors? So it's going to be easier for us to navigate inside the wind farm. And there are two examples of offshore wind farms we are now developing in France, Noirmoutier and Ile-de-Yeu, where we have specifically widened the channels between the rows of turbines, in these cases from 900 meters to 1600 meters, to allow the fishermen to do their passive and pelagic fishing inside the wind farms. The next thing we discuss with the fishing communities is exchange of data. So it's only right that we should share with fishing communities all the real-time data, not just about the location of the wind farms, but also where the cables are going to be and all the other related assets and the security zones around the wind farm. And then
I take it that's one of the reasons. I mean, you mentioned that trawling.
Yeah,
trawling is sort of verboten when it comes to wind farms. Presumably, that's because of the risk to cables and the like being dragged up.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, yeah. Now, we actually gain quite a lot from the extensive knowledge of the marine environment that the fishing communities have when we develop our wind farms, and we often tap in to this knowledge. They've got a unique skill set which they can lend, and in some cases do actively lend, to the protection of the wind farm assets, to marine observation and data collection as well. So we are always trying to work as closely and collaboratively as possible. Now, it varies from country to country, to be quite honest, how we get on, okay? In the Netherlands, the government actually sits us down together with the fishing community before any decisions are taken about where the next set of offshore wind farms are going to be built. And 2 years ago, we were literally sat in a hotel by the Dutch government for 48 hours in the Netherlands with the fishing community, and maps were on the table, and the two sides, the wind industry and the fishing industry for the whole of the Netherlands, agreed where the next generation of Dutch offshore wind farms are going to be built and what the rules will be on fishing in and around those wind farms. That's a very good example of how stakeholder consultation is done in a comprehensive and fully collaborative way. In other instances, it's done on a more localized basis.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Well, we're halfway through our discussion about the blue economy and the biodiversity aspects of promotion of sustainable economic activities. I'm joined here by Giles Dickson. You've just been hearing him. He's the Chief Executive of WindEurope. By Nicola, Notaro, the Head of Nature Protection with the European Commission. And by Marine Julliand of Total Energy and of the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. Marine, let me come back to you now. One of the things is very clear from what Giles is saying is that for anyone looking out at the seas in the future, there are going to be vast numbers of structures coming up above the waves. But the oil and gas industry, of course, already has many structures. Now, one assumes that over time they're going to be reduced. You've talked about removing the iron jacket, or the steel jacket, I think you were talking. Are those structures going to be? Are they going to end up on the ocean floor, becoming new reefs, for example? Or are they actually, all those structures, the basic structure, going to continue to exist above the waves? Can you just explain that? I'm unclear.
Yeah, we can go back to the topic of decommissioning. As I said, some structures would be removed, right? And some would be left in place when it is not feasible to remove them. Some of them were designed a very long time ago, and they were not designed to be removed, right? You've got technical constraints preventing them to be removed, or also when it may make sense, and that's what we're hoping, when it makes sense on a case-by-case basis to leave them in place. But they're not left and not monitored. They're always monitored to ensure that they would not pose a risk to the other sea users, right? So so they might be above. I mean, they're always marked, you know, on the nautical charts. There might be there are international maritime organization rules as well on how, you know, how much if you cut and you just leave the bottom legs on the floor, then how much space you need to allow for navigation to take place. But, you know, going back to topic of marine protected areas, well, you've got exclusion zones around the structures because you can't allow bottom trawling to take place. So even if they're not MPAs as such, I think it's important to investigate what could be their role in terms of connectivity.
Well, okay, just touching that, and maybe bring in Nicola. Just tell me, when it comes to what spawning areas and fish nurseries, I mean, have we had research work done on the extent to which an exclusion zone around an oil or gas rig, for example, leads to a regeneration of marine activity? I just wondered, is it we tend to think these days, because of climate change, of oil and gas rigs being, you know, negative in a negative context, but from a marine environment point of view, have they been proven to be beneficial?
So there is research going on, and some research indicate a positive aspect and a positive impact of the structures. So I think I mentioned the InSight project program in the UK, looking at potential value of those infrastructures. There are other studies going on. One of them is about to be published by the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and looking more specifically on pipelines. But going back to, you know, if we think biodiversity and conservation and MPAs, I mean, to me, it looks like, okay, what is a conservation objective, right? Why are we establishing a marine protected area? And then the importance of the monitoring program, you know, the facility being in activity or decommissioned, the monitoring program allowing to check that you're meeting your conservation objective, you know, when you establish a marine protected area, or when you have a facility, but some conservation objectives still attached to it. So a scientific monitoring program that the industry cannot do by itself. It's a dialogue with the researchers and with the authorities, who are the ones that decide on the conservation objective.
Nicola, given that the wind farms are likely to extend well beyond marine protected areas, you're talking about having 30% of Europe's seas declared as protected areas for one reason or another. We've heard that wind farms can, in many cases, coexist with these, but they're going to extend far beyond that. I mean, in practice, then, from the fishing point of view, there's even more than 30% of the seas where activities are going to be restricted. Is that not going to be the case? I mean, maybe you know, if this ends up in a restoration of the biomass of the seas, there'll be more fish to be caught where you're allowed to catch it.
Yes, I think that rather than restricted in absolute terms, you're talking about regulating fishing in different ways depending on the areas, and somehow fishermen are already used to that, because they're not allowed to fish just anything everywhere at sea. So obviously what we are laying down here is new coexistence rules that should allow everyone to maximize the benefits and reducing the environmental impacts. For instance, my colleagues are working together with international bodies like ICES to identify in the Baltic and North Sea what are the areas which are bottom trawled, and what are the areas that actually yield the maximum for fishing purposes. And you can see from the preliminary results that actually there are some areas that are trawled for very little economic output, while in fact the most interesting part for fishermen is much more limited. So it is clear that we need to identify ways of using the different parts of the sea in a more clever way compared to what we have been doing so far, in order to minimize the impacts. Of course, our focus is on protected areas, but we want to ensure sustainable use of the marine resources everywhere, not just in protected areas. So maximum sustainable yield, as you know very well, it's an objective that we have to some extent failed to achieve, and we need to achieve everywhere in all sea basins of the EU. So that's why I was referring to maritime spatial planning before. But it's very interesting what Giles said about the approach of the Netherlands bringing together different stakeholders to the same table in order to have a common plan. But you know, the fish and the mammals don't go to that tables. So we need to make sure that also nature conservation has a voice in this strategic planning system, because otherwise, if the space is already reserved for different activities and then nature conservation comes as an afterthought, then it's too late. We create a lot of conflict.
Yeah, please, Giles.
Can I reassure you directly, Nicola, and apologies for not having made this clear earlier. Not only were the wind industry and the Dutch fishing industry locked into a hotel for 48 hours, the relevant Dutch NGOs were also in that same hotel. Yeah, specifically the Dutch North Seas Foundation, a very reputable organization of whom I'm sure you are aware and work closely with.
Maureen, did you want to come in, please?
Yeah, I'd like to draw a parallel with the strategic environmental impact assessments that are conducted before licenses for oil and gas operations are being opened. The strategic environmental impact assessment would look at large areas. So we're not fine-tuned. This is not a fine-tuned project EIA. It's looking at the area, the type of activities that would take place, and identifying the key sensitivities, right? And this is open. I mean, this is open for public consultation. So and this is led by the competent authority, who are going to open the round of licenses, and that's a very preliminary step where you do hear about environmental and conservation concerns, but also economical concerns such as fisheries and so on. You identify these concerns and you can manage them very early on. Then when your individual project comes and there's an individual project environmental impact assessment that is done, it is just to fine tune, right? Like exact location and so on. But the main concerns of the region have been identified at the strategic environmental impact assessment stage.
Okay. Nicola, I've been talking about asking questions about what goes on beneath the waves. What about above the waves? Do you still regard wind turbines, or does the Commission still regard wind turbines as being bird killers?
Well, of course, wind turbines have an impact on birds, and that's why it's so important that the right location for them is chosen. The impacts are multiple. There can be collision, there can be displacement, there can be impacts on foraging areas. So this is very important to address. Now, what has just been said on strategic impact assessment, of course, is essential, because it's already at that stage that you identify the locations that are less risky with the maximum energy potential, and that helps you reducing a lot of the conflicts. When you go down to the level of project, then of course you're more talking about the mitigation, because the area in which the project will be located has already been identified. I don't think that the Commission has ever characterized wind turbines as bird killers, but of course we have certainly identified their impacts and suggested ways to address them in line with the legislation, because obviously we have the Birds Directive that protects the birds. And the guidance we have developed and updated last year on wind energy development provides a lot of best practices and lots of very good advice to reduce these conflicts and to try and develop the most environmentally sound trade-offs. And I was referring before to the development of sensitivity maps, and this is also a tool that can help rule out the areas that are more sensitive. You don't want to put turbines right in the middle of the flyway, basically.
Well, Giles, you referred earlier to bubbles technology to reduce the impact of the noise of constructing a wind turbine. What about? Do you have any clever tricks to defer bird strikes?
So, as Nicola said earlier, we do not build wind farms, whether onshore or offshore, inside migratory routes or along migratory routes, and there was extensive work done with the maps and with the nature organizations, and Nicola talked about the sensitivity mapping earlier. This is all extremely helpful work which guide us on the decisions we take about where to locate onshore and offshore wind farms. Secondly, we put special cameras and other devices on some turbines inside wind farms now, which help us detect when birds are approaching, and where we perceive the risk of collision to be significant, we can turn off the turbines concerned and then turn them on again when that risk has receded. This is not just about birds, it's also about bats. So we have ultrasonic devices that we put on turbines. Nicola, you'll be familiar with this, that give out a sound and actually deter the bats from flying near to the wind turbines. It's worth just sharing with you and with the audience some figures here. I can't pretend that there are never any collisions between wind turbines and birds and bats. What I can share with you is that academic studies have shown that for each collision between wind turbines and a bird, that there are 900 birds killed by motor cars, 2,500 birds killed because they have flown into buildings, and 10,250 birds killed by cats.
I knew you were going to say that because, you know, my cat is going to get punished for this. So I just knew you were going to come up with that comparison. Let me turn to a completely different subject, but equally distressing to me, which is that of Brexit. Because when we're talking about the marine environment and indeed offshore wind generation, you can hardly ignore the fact that we have a former member state which is, you know, a very, very much a coastal state. Giles, how much has this changed? How much has Brexit changed the planning of wind development? The UK, after all, has been a leading force in this, the leading force, perhaps.
The UK is and remains the leading force in the world, not just in Europe, in the development of offshore wind. The UK has more offshore wind than anyone in Europe today, than any other country in the world. And it plans to build an additional 30 gigawatts of offshore wind over this decade, so that they will have 40 gigawatts in total by 2030. And Europe as a whole will have around 110 gigawatts. So that sort of puts into context the relative importance of the UK in the expansion of offshore wind across the whole of Europe. Brexit hasn't really changed things there. As you know, Chris, the new nuclear plants, not as many are going to come online as in the UK as was once hoped. They're coming online more slowly. The UK has not managed to generate as many investments in new gas-fired power stations, so they really need these offshore wind farms. And the wind industry is working there extensively to develop all these offshore wind farms, yeah. And
just before I turn to our other colleagues, how much of the wind farm development that Europe envisage, well, where's it going to be taking place if it's not off, now that the UK is out of the EU? Where are going to be the main development areas?
we will continue to see significant expansion of offshore wind in the North Sea. The North Sea will be just under half of all of Europe's offshore wind by 2050. We will see significant build out in the Baltic Sea. Poland wants to have at least 10 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2040. All three Baltic states want to have it as well. We will see France developing. France is now building its first offshore wind farms as we speak. They will have significant amounts of offshore wind as well. And then we will see offshore wind starting in the Mediterranean, and we hope also in the Black Sea. Now, in the Mediterranean, to a large extent in the Black Sea, and also to a large extent in the Atlantic, it won't be the what we call bottom fixed offshore wind farms that we've had in Europe up until now, largely. It will be floating offshore wind farms. And we think that floating offshore wind will be 1/3 of Europe's total offshore wind capacity by 2050.
And floating wind farms, I mean, in practice, the structures have to be presumably tied down by cables onto the seabed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so you have a floating structure, and there are different designs of floating structure. Some of them are relatively flat on the surface of the sea. They may be a triangular or a square shape with a turbine on one point of those geometrical structures. They may be a spar buoy, up to 80 meters long. You have 10 meters above the sea, 70 meters below the sea. But whichever your floating structure, you will usually have 3 cables that are connecting that floating structure to very large stone anchors on the seabed. 3 such cables. They are usually not taut, of course. I mean, they can't be. There is some slack which allows the floating turbine to sway slightly, but never more than 3 degrees from its central vertical point. Now, we do floating offshore wind farms beyond 50 meters sea depth. Up to 50 meters, we do the bottom fixed offshore wind turbines.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Marine, I also wanted to ask you, because I was talking about the dismantling of oil and gas platforms, as though that's, the only thing that's going to happen. But of course, in the Mediterranean, which Giles just mentioned, I mean, Turkey and Cyprus and the like are planning on exploiting the reserves there. So, this is not, there may be new structures built.
There could be new structures, but going back to your question on Brexit, which is also, I mean, a parallel can be drawn when you talk about some countries around the Mediterranean, is I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight the importance of the Regional Seas Convention, right? In the North Sea, you've got OSPAR for the North Atlantic, but in the Mediterranean, you've got Barcelona Convention, which is under the umbrella of the United Nations Environmental Programme. This convention aim at environmental protection. And as you can imagine, they're already starting to think about the new energies, right? OSPAR is thinking about how they can manage cumulative impacts of offshore wind already. So it's important that there's a coherence of regulatory framework between EU and the regional seas for this aiming at the same environmental protection.
Nicola, the Commission wants not only to halt the potential damage to biodiversity of the seas, but also to restore the ecosystems. For example, presumably seagrass and coral reefs and such like. I mean, what active role will Brussels be playing in that? Or will it simply be left to member states and their own nature protection services to take their own initiatives?
Well, of course, we do not implement directly restoration activities from Brussels, and they have to take place on the ground. But I think we will be having, hopefully, a quite positive impact on different levels. The first one is by setting the targets and the direction in which we want to go. And it's our proposals for the marine protected areas that have then been endorsed by the Council and very recently by the European Parliament as well. which set the pace for the activities of restoration that will take place. We'll propose legislation, as I said, with targets to be achieved. And we hope that member states will develop restoration plans that we will be able to peer review and to improve where necessary. And of course, there's a major role for European funding in that respect. I mean, from the smaller funds dedicated to the environment, such as LIFE and the MFAF, so the Maritime and Aquaculture and Fisheries Fund, to projects under Horizon, and in fact, even under the recovery plans that are being adopted these days, some member states have put biodiversity very much at the center, some others much less. But also those plans, of course, can have a major impact in terms of restoration. So we will hopefully act both as a stimulus and to accompany the process in terms of providing technical inputs, and also as partners in terms of financing on some of the activities that will take place.
You mentioned earlier that we have a dearth of scientific knowledge in some areas, big holes that need to be filled. I mean, if these are very ambitious policies that you are pursuing here, people will want to know whether we're getting any success and whether the outcome is positive. So we've got to have to measure, we've got to assess the existing situation, and in order to be able to measure any improvement that takes place over subsequent years. So is that issue being addressed?
Yes, in fact, of course, knowledge evolves all the time, and but it's not a reason that should prevent us from taking action, which is for sure going to be win-win action. So there are, of course, a lot of studies and a lot of information on the situation of biodiversity at sea in the various sea basins. And it is possible to identify, for instance, the areas that would benefit most from strict protection systems, which would allow them for self-restoration, which would in turn be particularly beneficial, for instance, for fishermen. But of course, at the same time, we need to build further our knowledge and address the knowledge gap. And the biodiversity, sorry, the blue economic communication refers specifically to ocean missions under the Horizon program, where considerable funding, I think it's the first time that we see so much funding related to marine and to biodiversity under the research program, is dedicated also to address that very gap. Obviously, you know, financial means are never enough, and you always want more to do more, but the dynamic that has been generated by the Green Deal proposed by the Commission is, in my 25-year experience working on environmental issues, is absolutely unprecedented and extraordinary.
Okay, thank you very much. Giles, I was going to throw one last question at you, because going from one that's been dialed in just now, which is simply to say that you referred earlier to the bubbles, the bubble technology designed to reduce the noise impact of constructing a wind turbine. By how much does that reduce the noise impact?
Oh, very significantly indeed, to the point that the sea mammals then happily return to the area after the piling has finished. It's just one of the protocols that we follow when we build wind farms, and the many protocols that we follow when we operate offshore wind farms. Now, clearly the industry, as we've discussed this morning, takes its environmental responsibilities very seriously, so much so that we have now formed a coalition with a group of leading NGOs, with WWF, BirdLife, Climate Action Network Europe. It's called the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. Ocean is its abbreviation, and the purpose of this coalition is to draw up detailed protocols on what is the environmentally friendly way to deliver this huge expansion of offshore wind that the European Union wants. And we're working extensively with the NGOs on these protocols. We will then share the protocols with all the governments that are doing offshore wind around Europe. And this is very helpful to the governments because, you know, naturally ministers and the public think, well, can we deliver all this offshore wind in a sustainable way? And when they see that the wind industry and the environmental NGOs have worked out the way of doing it, then that is a matter of great reassurance for them, and they follow the protocols that we have developed.
Okay, thank you very much all. I've got to bring this to an end. So let me first of all just thank IOGP, the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers, for sponsoring this discussion. And let me thank our participants. You just heard from Giles Dickson, the Chief Executive of WindEurope. And we've been hearing also from Marine Julliand of Total Energy and IOGP, and from Nicola Notaro, the Head of Nature Protection with the European Commission. Can I just say, I wish you all every success in your future work. And I suppose if there's one lesson we take away from this discussion, having heard Giles in particular, is that we all need to get used to eating even more mussels than we may do at the moment. Okay, thank you very much indeed. All the very best to you.
Thank you.